Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute, and I'm especially delighted to welcome all of you this afternoon to our conference on transatlantic cooperation in an era of crisis and competition. This is a joint conference being held with our new research partners from the Institut Montaigne in Paris, and the Institut Montaigne is, it's fair to say, France's premier non-governmental think tank in France. I think that can be said straightforward without any exaggeration, and we're delighted by this new partnership. France is, of course, a critical partner of the United States in so many ways as our friends in the UK deal with Brexit and step back from the global scene, as our friends in Germany also go in their own direction. The United States increasingly cooperates with France on a global level in the Middle East, obviously in Europe, in Asia, and beyond. And we're delighted by this new partnership. And I myself am also delighted by this partnership and by the fact that this morning I was able to welcome back one of my professors from Sciences Po, Jacques Rupnik, and reconnect with him after a number of years, and it's been an absolute pleasure. We had a wonderful and frank, useful working session this morning, and this afternoon we have the pleasure and the honor of welcoming two of the, I guess we call them the éminences grises of the French foreign policy scene, to Hudson for a panel discussion that's going to be moderated by Ben Judah, who is a research fellow at the Kleptocracy Initiative. Ben's the author of two books, Fragile Empire, about Russia, and This is London. He is Franco-British, though we often think of him as British, primarily here at Hudson, and he's, of course, a contributor to the New York Times, Financial Times, other publications as well. And he'll be joined on the panel by our Hudson Institute colleague, Peter Rao, who is a fellow with us and who does work on transatlantic relations, particularly focused on the Germanophone world, but has just returned from Spain, and Peter's work has appeared in such publications as the National Review, the American Interest, and various German publications as well on these questions. And for our panel, we have the honor of receiving two noted French specialists, as I mentioned earlier. François Godement is the Dean of Observers of China in France. I think it's fair to say. He's teaches at Sciences Po, taught before at Longzhou, has been an advisor to the French Foreign Ministry, and is now senior advisor to the Institut Montaigne. And Michel Duclos is a distinguished French diplomat, served as first as an ambassador in Syria from 2009 to 2012, which was particularly a moment of great turmoil in Syria, which the turmoil continues, and he has just published a new book, La Longue Nuit Syrienne, the long night of Syria, 10 years of diplomatic impotence, it's called, and it's a book highly recommended. Michel is widely known in diplomatic circles in Europe. He also served as ambassador to Switzerland, served previously in Moscow, Bonn, and also at the United Nations. And so without any, and Michel is, and people I have heard of for some time, and delighted to make their acquaintance finally through this joint venture. And on that note, I will turn it over to Ben, who will begin this event, and looking forward to a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Ken, and thank you so much for everyone for being here today. I wanted to begin this conversation by setting out what we think the situation is. And I'd love to ask Michel what his sort of tour d'horizon, to use a French term, would be of transatlantic relations as they currently stand.
Thank you, Ben. I'm very intimidated to have to speak in front of such a distinguished audience, of course. Let me say that there has been a long history of disagreement and misunderstanding, as we used to say, between America and Europe. And if you think at the time of the Suez crisis in 1956, of course, the current situation is relatively good. And apart from this very specific episode, there used to be a lot of disagreements, for instance, on NATO strategy at the time of General de Gaulle, or about Russia and the East-West relations when the Germans launched détente policy, Ostpolitik, or on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. There is a long history of disagreement between the two parts of the Transatlantic alliance. The issue of burden sharing, of the French, Germans, the Brits and others being free riders, this is not new at all, of course. This is also something that has been with us since a long time. I would say that what is new and what is especially worrisome in the current situation is due to two factors. First, the list is very long. It's still longer than it has never been. And now it touches things like Iran, JCPOA, but also trade, but also climate change. And that is a second factor which should give us a pause to reflection, and that this list of disagreements goes to fundamental aspect of the world order. In one way, at the global level, that is to say that it is on multilateralism, on the way to solve issues that we have to face in the new century, that there is a new fundamental disagreement. And B, between Europe and the US, for the first time, the current US administration is questioning the way Europe organizes itself through the European Union. The America used to be the main supporter of the EU. It's not anymore the case. And we in Europe, we have the feeling from time to time that Washington is picking and choosing what they like in Europe, especially Central Europe, for instance, or France or Germany or UK for specific issues, but globally distancing itself more and more from the EU institutions, and even sometimes qualifying the EU institution as adversaries. And this is something which is probably with no precedent in the relationship between Europe and the US. Maybe a last word. In the most pessimistic analysis in Europe, I'm not sure those analyses are right, there is a more general feeling that now what is missing is the glue between the societies in Europe and in America, which is somewhat a bit strange because in another way, one could say that politics in Europe, in America, has never been such as aligned as it is the case before. We are facing the same challenges, such as populism, which is something also which didn't used to exist before.
So just before turning to François, I want to put you on the spot with one question, which is, given we're now beginning to run down the clock on the first Trump administration, or we shall see, do you think that things have been as bad as expected from the point of view of the first weeks of the administration and a lot of fears that were circulating in European capitals? Or do you think we've been on a more optimistic trend of transatlantic relations, given where we were those years ago?
There has been already several phases in the foreign policy of the Trump administration. In the first phase, if you remember, the idea was that we were facing a kind of a new Reagan. And as it used to be the case with Reagan, at some point the establishment will be able in the US to regain its influence, and that the new man will progressively fit more or less the traditional pattern. That did not happen. And it's exactly the opposite which happened. That is to say that Trump was able to emancipate himself from the influence of the establishment and become, in foreign policy, more and more himself. And seen from Europe, it means that he radicalized himself, and especially JCPOA was a litmus test, where in the first phase, Trump grumbled but went along with the policy, and at some point he changed the policy completely. Now, are we entering a third phase, a fourth phase? Where is it going to go? That is the big uncertainty that we are facing in Europe.
Thank you. I'd love to ask François to sort of pick up on that topic of where Trump has emancipated himself and made policy more and more in his own image, and that issue would obviously be China and trade. Do you agree with that analysis? Do you think that this is a break with previous administrations? Do you think this is a break with Europe?
Thank you first for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak to you. And I can't say I haven't been moved by my colleague and friend Michel's description, but China and Asia is a specific matter within this overall panorama. So my picture will probably be slightly different. I also have the backdrop of having watched previous administrations, and especially the Obama administration dealing with the region. It's a break, very clearly. It's not a break with Europe. On the contrary, there is more convergence, at least in the analysis of what the problem is, not always on what the solution is, and especially not on the cooperative approach to the solution, but on what the problem is. There is convergence. We have learned the hard way. And we have learned the hard way in part because China looks at strength and moves from reacts to strength. So China has a very different view of President Trump as what you could say is the average public opinion in Europe. Much more considerate of the risks associated with Donald Trump and with the problem that he presents to China, when we have tended at the beginning, indeed, as you say, to thought that he would unavoidably be domesticated, so to speak, and he has not. So that's the first difference. The second difference is that China doesn't look a lot at Europe when relations go well with the US, because it assumes that Europe is a foregone conclusion. Remember the entrance into WTO, the difficulty that Europe had in making its own point in the last year of negotiation, because the Chinese assumed that everything had been spoken for and that we just had to sign on the dotted line. So that's one occasion when China is not particularly looking at Europe. And when the relations with the US turn into a crisis, which indeed is the case today, then China looks even more at the US in different ways, whether it will be able to retaliate, whether it will have somehow to withstand the pressure. And in spite of all the good words which are extended to Europe, but not only to Europe, also to Japan, to India to some extent, to try and break the possible encirclement of which China is always afraid. Despite that, there aren't many results forthcoming from China. We have had our own education also on issues such as investment, high tech, intellectual property, rules, and so forth. So what I find is there has been parallel reasoning. The frustrations are there, indeed, with the Trump administration, but not always in the ways that you would think. In the past 9 months, for example, I've seen 3 times the top-level Asia and China people from the Trump administration, from the National Security Council in Europe, talking to people both officially and officiously. I'm trying to think, when would it have ever happened during the Obama administration? I don't think it ever happened, or certainly not at that rhythm. So there is a paradox there, which sometimes the media miss, in fact, of a need for the US to get closer to allies. I'm not sure this is reflected in presidential tweets. I'm not sure this is reflected in other initiatives on the trade front, for example, or on political front towards the essence of the EU, which you were talking about, Michel. But on this crucial area of how do we deal with China, this has been a change. And so the paradox is when you move into professional circles of EU diplomacy or government, whether at the EU level or into some of the core governments, you find people who are more attached to this notion of transatlantic cooperation than they may have been 5 years ago. They were probably more skeptical about what could practically be achieved. The difference is that they used to fear benign neglect. Now they fear tweets, which is a different, kind of issue. It's, to some extent, it's not a tepid relationship. There are problems, but the nature of the problems has changed. The big issue we have today is how far do we go together and where do we stop? My main problem on that front is that how should I say, if I say the war goals, it's a very exaggerated, everybody keeps using war metaphors for, what is a trade conflict, what could be a technology conflict, or at worst, a blockade, but we have seen a lot of that before, and it was not a war. So the metaphors are exaggerated, and in a sense, they serve the other side, which can point out how badly it is being treated. But the problem is we don't see the end aims, the end goals of this administration in a number of areas. We know that it's not going to get all that it wants in terms of concession, especially structural concessions from China, for example. Where does it stop? Or could it even backtrack? These are the issues of reliability of the partnership is something that is becoming essential. The second issue is that just as we narrowly avoided signing on the dotted line for entrance into WTO, and at the time Pascal Lamy was trade commissioner and managed to inject some degree of European negotiation, we'd like not to be told what we need to do, or we'd like to be participating in the decisions. That is particularly important as you see barriers coming up, for example, in terms of high tech, investment screening. There are parallel moves underway in the US, in Europe, in Japan, but there's a very big problem of mutual information, mutual coordination. It involves very sensitive issues because these are sensitive areas. It therefore involves a degree of mutual trust, and it also involves participating in the decisions. That is also what is currently afoot on popular controversies such as the 5G issue and Huawei, for example. There is partly an economic issue, but partly also it's an issue of how is the decision reached, what's the proof. This gets into your more general narrative. But I would, I don't know how long I can go before
just a little bit longer.
Just a little bit on this. I think that we on the whole are closer in terms of views to the US than we have ever been on this front. It doesn't extend to what I would call healthy competition in other parts of Asia. And so I hasten to say that there are still triangles going on in terms of trade competition, and we fear very much some of what the US may be doing on WTO, which is essentially going to be reflected with Asia, because this is still, all in all, the rising trade power, or the rising trade powers, plural form, of the world. So again, the uncertainty about, or maybe unfortunately the certainty that the administration may be out to get WTO by paralyzing the appellate tribunal, that's a worry for us. We're at the same time struggling. There is something that's in parallel with the JCPOA, yes, that we're desperately trying to get the Chinese to concede, to make concessions for WTO reform. Some of them I personally think are going to be unattainable, such as renouncing the developing economy status. They will only renounce on it bit by bit and not formally. But others, such as including subsidies, including industrial policies, including digital, in new aspects of WTO, this might have a chance of going forward. But if the Chinese feel that WTO is going to be liquidated anyway, we have less likelihood of being able to succeed in this. So there are, again, I started by saying there is a common analysis, convergent, but perhaps not on process. This is one of the areas where there is the biggest issue right now. A last remark on geostrategic events. I would say there, Europe looks like, you know, that famous map of the American continent from New York to San Francisco that the New Yorker always used to have, where New York is immense and San Francisco is a kind of outpost. For action on strategic issues, it's clearly the French and the British. It used to be the British and the French. Now I feel that it's not illegitimate to say it's the French and the British in terms of effort, in terms of participation, for very good reasons, which also involve our maritime domain, which also involve the fact that we don't have a traditional reluctance to use force, that we depend a lot on the alliance elsewhere, Near East, Sahel. There are very good reasons for that. I can't say that these reasons are fought or contradicted by other Europeans. They're just less shared. Or rather, Europeans tend to tug in behind, including Germany, which, however, has been making some adjustments. So we don't have the kind of conflict or crisis that we had at the time of the Vietnam War, or when de Gaulle, for example, was there, or even at the time of the second Iraq War. But we have nuances and difficulties in aligning Europeans, in getting their contributions, and that also requires a continuing US effort in public diplomacy on that front. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask both of the French panelists a very quick question, which is, you've outlined this paradox where we have very, very emotional and heightened rhetoric about the crisis of the transatlantic relationship. You've both said, historically, compared to some of the lows of Vietnam or the lows of the Suez crisis, things are actually relatively okay, and sketched out two contradictory trends. One is that the logic of great power politics, the US needs Europe, is driving the partners close together on China. The other is that there's Michel sketched out a logic where the US wants to emancipate itself from US structures that it believes are binding its hands on trade, on Iran in particular. Which trend do you think will win out? The US desire to emancipate itself from Europe, or the US need for Europe to confront China? So a brief answer from both of my French colleagues.
I have an answer which really depends. Maybe I'm too Europe-centered, but I think it's Europe that has the answer. If we get our act together, if we demonstrate that the EU is there to stay and is not a fleeting supranational institution, if therefore we're able to trade effectively, to negotiate effectively, we will compel the US to look at us. if there is a bet that in any case we're disorganized, are likely to go on different ways, then I think the isolationist, let's call it by its name, the isolationist trend, which was already visible in US policy, the pullback from Europe also to Asia Pacific, will increase. So I think the answer, we know the trends in the US. I personally think also, that after the number of wars the US has participated in and the criticism to which they have been subjected, essentially, for leading those wars, including from us,
Yes.
It's not surprising that there is a lull in engagement. So a lot of it depends on Europe making sense for itself.
And Michel, which trend do you think will overpower in the medium run or the long run?
I think that we should come together again under three conditions. First, as François said, the Europeans are able to make their case, and notably as far as China is concerned, of course. And for instance, it's up to the Europeans to show that you can't contain China expansionism in Europe if you don't support the European institutions, on one part. Second condition, the Americans themselves, they have to realize that it's not good to be isolated. And when you are extremely powerful, which remains the case of the US, you always have friends, of course, but you have to distinguish between true friends and other friends. And at some point, I am confident that this feeling inside this administration will become more and more clear that the US needs friends and allies. And third, and this is common to Europe and to the US, we probably have to shift the agenda. As long as we are discussing traditional issues of burden sharing, of Russia's threat, of military positioning in Europe, outside Europe, and so on, we will continue the same quarrels. So it's very important, I think it's also why we are there today, to look at new issues such as China, but also cybersecurity, such as new threats to democratic institutions, such as Africa, the development in the world, on which there could be common ground.
Thank you. And
climate change, of course, is part of the agenda.
So in a way, the Trump effect has perhaps been less destructive than expected initially or written about. And I'd love to ask Peter, my colleague, what he feels on this situation.
Thank you, Ben. This is my home institution, but I never take for granted the opportunity to speak, so thanks for having me. It's also good to see some friends in the audience. And maybe I'll just make three very quick observations about what has been said, and then maybe offer a thesis, which I'll try to back up, or a hypothesis, which I'll try to work the logic out of. The first observation on America's traditional support for European integration. I remember during the transition period into the Trump administration in the late fall of 2016, early 2017, I went to the State Department. I remember asking a fairly high-ranking State Department official about American support for European integration, which traditionally we've always expressed. And the answer was, we're not sure, not just because the Trump administration might have more nationalist attitudes, but at least half the equation is that Europe itself does not know where it wishes to go. Even within the liberal grouping in European Parliament, which is known as one of the champions of European integration, it ranges from Charles Michel all the way to Emmanuel Macron, who have different views about the scope and depth of EU integration. So Europe is mature enough to where even in such a cataclysmic event as Brexit, the United States, aside from the occasional presidential tweet, has not involved itself in excavating and setting out what the architecture should look like in Europe going forward. So I think in part the answer lies in Europe, in part with the president. Which brings me to the president and the second point I just thought I'd make in reaction to what has been said. I think the Trump foreign policy really exists of two poles. On the one hand, he is undoubtedly a nationalist, much like nationalist leaders we've come to know in Europe and elsewhere in the world. But on the other hand, he's the president of the United States, to his great dismay, because the president of the United States has larger ordering responsibilities that a nationalist in, say, Italy does not have to contend with. And so I think the Trump foreign policy is a constant flow and ebb between, on the one hand, nationalist impulses, and on the other hand, great power responsibilities. And in that mix, I think, we find some of the decisions that the president takes. We've expressed it differently. It can be the establishment advisory class and his own instincts, but I think that's basically the ideological current that's at work. And the last point about transatlantic cooperation towards China, since it was raised, there's no doubt that there are opportunities there, but I think we should be very aware that the more we are able to forge a common transatlantic line, the more likely we're able to find resistance in Beijing. In Washington, we have European observers, and then we have Asia observers, who mostly operate in kind of their own separate fiefdoms. But I think as we've come together, as China has risen on the agenda over the past few years, we've come to notice that whenever relations are bad between Beijing and Washington, the Chinese like to run to the Europeans, and vice versa. If things aren't going great with the Europeans, they'll look for support in Washington. I remember the last round of tariffs that the president, or maybe it was the previous round, that he announced against the Chinese. Within days, Olaf Scholz, the German finance minister, was happily announcing a new banking arrangement in Beijing. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Having said that, let me very quickly offer a hypothesis that US-European transatlantic relations are much more structural than they are personality-driven. And I'll just start with a very brief observation. Really, not since the end of the Cold War has the US elected a foreign policy president. In 1992, a war hero was defeated by a president from an irrelevant backwater state from Arkansas on the mantra, "It's the economy, stupid." 8 years later, President George W. Bush, who governed a border state to Mexico, so that relationship was important to him, but he clearly ran a domestic politics campaign, was able to beat Al Gore. 6 years later, after spending only a year and a half in the Senate, before that he was essentially a provincial politician from Illinois, Senator Obama launched his presidential campaign and became president. And while we know that Donald Trump has business interests around the world, I was in Istanbul recently, and there was the great big Trump emblazoned on the side of a skyscraper. I don't think anyone labors under the illusions that he's read Clausewitz or Sun Tzu or thought about foreign policy aside from the instinct that he brings to the table before he became president. And the implication of that is, in every other region of the world, presidents can envision regions anew. I mean, we've mentioned the JCPOA. There was a radical shift from the foreign policy of George W. Bush to President Obama on the Middle East, and back again under President Trump. But in Europe, we have an existing multilateral structure, an entry point through which every president can envision the region, and they don't need to re-envision how to think about Europe. And that, of course, is NATO. NATO, so long as individual Western countries underinvest in defense, and so long as supranational structures like permanent structured cooperation or the defense fund are relatively small, will remain the guarantor of Western security. And I think whenever the European Union, the other great multilateral organization in Europe, has leaned out in front of NATO, as the Ukrainians can tell us, there has been a danger on the horizon. So the interplay between the EU on the one hand and NATO on the other, I think, is going to decide what the Western partnership looks like in the coming decades. I think it also explains why we're having difficulties in the transatlantic alliance. Europe's an economic giant, albeit with flagging demography and probably weak growth due to an innovation deficit, but an economic giant, but it's a military dwarf. And so I think Europe has, in a lot of respects, contented itself. It's a status quo power. No region of the world has enjoyed the post-Cold War order more than the Europeans. And maybe the French, for example, are very actively looking to modernize the European Union. But I think Europe as a whole, with Germany as its center, is content and pleased where things stand. But the US has become a change agent, and I think that really explains some of the problems we're having. The Americans see the global order as increasingly hollowed out. I think that explains some of the disagreements we've had at the World Trade Organization, and the ability to enforce American and Western rules of the road increasingly receding. And so I think the US is pressing for change in the most optimistic reading before the distribution of power shifts to a point where we're no longer able to do that, which as a global superpower, we've always been charged to do, and the Europeans have not. And that is be able to enforce the rules of the road and be able to ensure that the West and our values permeate the international system. And that, of course, brings me to the big theme of the Trump administration, and that is that the revisionists are coming. The traditional analysis has been that the Russians and the Chinese can never team up because the Russians are basically a petro economy. What Russian goods, aside from vodka and caviar, is anyone interested in purchasing? None, really. It's all about oil and gas. And so they've wanted traditionally very high prices, whereas the Chinese, as a huge consumer, growing economy, have wanted low prices. And those, among other differences, have meant they can't really team up. I basically think that analysis it's not out the window, but it's increasingly in doubt. And so as the Iranians tie us down in the Middle East, and the Chinese proceed in the South China and East China Seas, and the Russians are active in the Ukraine, I think they're increasingly coming to the conclusion that the American-led order can be, if not toppled, at least contested in a serious way that hasn't taken place in the past. And that, I think, brings us to opportunities for collaboration, because this isn't just a military contest. It also gets to, I think, major economic and finance questions. A colleague of mine, who happens to be in the audience, sent me a report last week from the Peterson Institute, which showed that tariff levels from China toward Europe and the US had remained more or less the same until the US and China began this tit for tat. And while barriers went up from something like 8% to 20% on key goods, they lowered them for the Europeans to say 5 or 6%, which is to say the Europeans can free ride on America's China policy. I think this shows some of the challenges that are on the horizon. It also shows that the US needs Europe to not allow it to be a substitute actor when the Americans play hardball against China. And that, I think, creates an opportunity for the US. The Europeans can get their multilateral approach. They can join a competition with the US to make sure that their interests are represented in any arrangement with China. But in return, I think the Europeans will have to come a bit more the Americans' way to allow for that kind of a multilateral negotiation to take place. With that, I have many more points, but I'm sure they're better addressed in the Q&A. And thank you to my French colleagues from Paris for giving me the opportunity to join you on the panel.
Thank you. Thank you for that expert overview. I just wanted to add one more dimension to the conversation before we get into a more rapid fire amongst us, and then we open it up into the floor, which is, I'd like to ask Michel, what does his experience and his view of the Middle East show us about the questions of the world order today, building on a lot of what Peter was saying?
Let me make a couple of points. First, my experience in the Middle East is mainly about Syria, of course. I was ambassador to Damascus from 2006 to 2009, and after 2011, I was back having a lot of contacts with networks of people dealing with Syrian file and with Syrian fans themselves. And for me, Syria is a very painful experience because it can be analyzed as a strategic setback of the West, of the US, Europe, and their Western allies. A setback which, to some extent, turned into a kind of a defeat, let's say, on various levels. First, of course, systemic rivals such as Russia, but also Iran, were able to win, to score very important points. Secondly, the consequences of the Syrian conflict has had a huge impact on Europe through the terrorist attacks and the immigration flow, or at least the perception of immigration flow. That has been immensely helpful to the rise of populism. And third, in terms of human rights, rule of law, protection of civilian populations, the way a military operation should be conducted, the Syrian conflict has shown an incredible move backward if you compare with the values, norms, principles, conventions we were able to agree at the international level at the end of the 20th century. For all those reasons, the fact that both the US and its European partners were not able to deal with the issue, for me, is something of immense consequence for the future. It's unfortunately a blueprint for the new world in which we are living. And I'm afraid that for the time being, we have not yet drawn the lessons of this big setback. Now, the more general situation in the Middle East, I mean, the failure to deal with the Syrian crisis has a lot to do with the trend in the US to withdraw from the Middle East, the disengagement trend, which of course was very strong under Obama, but which is continuing today under other forms. And there, it's very strange because the people in the region, they believe that the Americans have already left. And they are basing their calculations on that. This notion that the US are not there anymore. In the same time, they see that the military capacity of the US in the region remain out of proportion with what the Russians or others are able to deploy. And that's an element in the current uncertainty on Iran and the last events in the Oman Sea, is that in the region you never know if the Americans are already elsewhere or if they are not on the verge of coming back with all their power. And probably if you were in Tehran and elsewhere, you have to test that to know better what's going to happen. And all that, I would say, is immensely unhealthy. It's a factor of big disorder in the region. Having said that, another element is that it's clear that the US, let's say, should be withdrawing or is in the process of withdrawing. The Russians are back. That's one of the big consequences of the Syrian conflict. Now, Mr. Putin is immensely influential into the region. He is considered as the new honest broker for the conflicts in the region. And the question is, aren't the Chinese coming? And most of the people in the region see the Chinese as already there in economic terms, extremely important as trade partners. And in the same times, the idea is that if they are so economically powerful, probably one day or another, they will become politically powerful too. So US withdrawing, Russia back, Chinese coming, where is Europe? That is a bit the question for the Middle East today.
So that brings me to a question that I'd like to ask François. Where do you see this trade triangle, or indeed this broader power triangle all over the world of the US, the EU, and China going forward?
Several points. First, I'm not sure we're in agreement on the, China bribing EU and EU cashing in the bribe, as you said more politely,
Yes.
on a number of grounds. Because trade is really, it's like a cattle market where everything is like horse trading, essentially. And so to take recent examples, yes, Xi Jinping and Liu He have flagged some sectoral concessions in a transactional way outside of any negotiation, and that's important for them, I think, never to give them inside a negotiation. But the concessions have been to both. Okay, BASF got something, Exxon did too, BMW and Daimler got something. Well, Tesla got a big gift in Shanghai. It's a big gift if it works, of course. Financial services, yes, to European insurers, but the credit card business starting to open up. One thing we can agree on is that often China makes these concessions in areas which have already matured and where they feel much less competition than 5 years ago. Take the plane market, where this is a cutthroat competition between Boeing and Airbus worldwide. Mysteriously, the deal in China is always 50-50, or more accurately, in 2018, it was 48.5 to 51.5. It may change this year, but it may as well be because of the 737 MAX issue, which is inflicting pain, as because of a Chinese solution. My feeling is, yes, the Chinese make these overtures to Europe, but what I see from the European perspective is that the delivery is not always there. Take examples of 3 agreements recently. One is on, it's a bit complicated for part of the audience, but to Europeans it's very important. Indications of geographical origins. Parma ham, Roquefort, or whatever. Important things to cognac.
Must be produced in that particular
Yes.
geographical localities. You can't make English Parma ham.
We haven't got
Italian
an agreement
Worcester sauce.
with China, in spite of signs that we might get one. The backstory is the US asked China not to grant the EU the agreement before it made its own. So that's a reverse story. Civil aviation, where again there is some competition. China has dragged its feet all through this period after having initialed an agreement. It took them 1.5 years to sign it, finally 2 weeks ago, after absolute peremptory demands from the EU, on the back, of course, of the Trump action. I'm not saying that Trump actions are not facilitating some action. There are other examples like this, which show that China is just a very tough negotiating partner, and then the notion by going slightly softer than your other guy, you're going to get something, that's a notion that's receding in Europe. So this is not to say the problem is not always there. It is always there. You always have to look at this kind of thing. The other question was, what was it about?
I'm just going to jump on to somebody else on the panel now. So I was struck by 2 things you said, Peter. One was this sort of structural analysis of transatlantic relations. So I'd like to kind of test that by the question of, if Trump wins another term versus if Trump doesn't win another term, do you think that transatlantic relations will look pretty similar 5 years down the line from that? Do you expect in both scenarios we still have NATO, we still have a similar-ish relationship? So that's my question to you. Maybe I'll let you ponder on that while I ask Michel another question based on your analysis, which is you talked about a change agent and how the US had become a change agent in that relationship. Didn't France attempt to become a change agent within Europe with the election of Emmanuel Macron? I'd like to hear your verdict on whether that has worked or been successful, or how much we can...
Not yet, no, it doesn't.
We're not yet in the too early to say about how the results of the French Revolution have unfolded, the sort of supposed Chinese saying of Liu Shaoxi, or not yet in an immediate political horizon?
I think that Macron has had two problems. First, the Germans were not there. That is to say, he based all his strategy on the idea that Chancellor Merkel will be re-elected, will reconvene a strong government, and will be able to follow or concur to his agenda because she will realize that France is delivering the reforms which were expected from our country since a long time. So that was the plan. And unfortunately for Macron, things did not go that way in the German elections. A lot of time were wasted, and Germany is not anymore the partner Macron hoped for to renew the European enterprise. But the second reason is maybe about Macron's methods or approach itself. He focused on a lot of very concrete issues, such as a budget for the Eurozone, structural reforms, and that has been interpreted by people who want to believe that Europe should change as very positive. And our friend, for instance, Tim Gartenach, wrote various articles saying a lot of good about Macron. But the general public didn't see exactly what was the point. If you suggest a lot of reforms, especially institutional reforms, you look like technocratic. And that's the worst thing in our era of populism that can happen to a leader. So I think that the last European elections have changed that a little bit. Now again, we can say, fortunately, the European issues are more politicized again. And that's the best thing that could happen to Europe and to Macron.
Now I'd like to circle back to you and put you on the spot, Peter. So looking forward from the next election, how much does it matter?
I do think it matters if President Trump's reelected or not, but I think there will be a fair amount of rhetorical garnish that might, on the surface, please the Europeans, but if the demands are the same, it might actually take away an excuse for cooperation with the U.S., or at least meeting some of the Americans' desires, if not demands. It's no secret, as you mentioned at the outset, that the 2% of GDP and 20% of that 2% invested in defense capabilities has been a longstanding demand going back to the 2014 Wales Summit, and in fact was raised long before that. Bob Gates, in his big departure talk, I think, pretty aggressively criticized the European for investment. So I don't think that will go away. I also, quite separately from NATO, just as a general point, would say that one shouldn't underestimate the power of bureaucracies and multilateral institutions, even when they faded and lost their relevance, will just continue on because they continue on. And so while within NATO, I don't think there would be any doubts about, say, a large Article 5 operation, the real question is, under the threshold of Article 5, how close and how intense is the work and the cooperation between the U.S. And the Europeans? Someone doesn't like what I'm saying. And there's so many examples of this. If, say, 6 or 7 semi-trailers pulled up to the Pentagon, agents walked into the Pentagon, stole the most important classified documents, loaded them on the truck, and drove away, that'd be a casus belli. But if it's done virtually, how does one handle that? And so I think there are lots of questions about below Article 5 cooperation. Thankfully, and I think this is a very good thing, a lot of this is handled by the permanent bureaucracies. And so I think I continue to see on disinformation, among other issues, close cooperation between the US and Europe. The second vector, and there are many more, but I'll just focus on the military and on the trade angle. I do think that the road to the White House in 2020 is traveling through the industrial Midwest, which is known to be lagging slightly behind the rest of the country in its appreciation for, support for, I don't want to say free trade, but a certain kind of continuation of the existing trading regime. And so given that that's the case, I suspect that, and we've already seen this, some of the positions that the 2020 Democratic candidates will roll out will look slightly closer to President Trump's trade policy than one might imagine. At least they won't be polar opposites. So I think that's I think there's likely to be a bit more continuity there.
One last question for François, and then I'd like to open it up to your questions. And thank you for sitting there so patiently, waiting for this moment. To what extent do France and Germany have the same China policy? And do you view those policies as coming together or moving apart?
They have got much closer, I would say, since 2016, and it's a continuous movement. The clincher was what I call the blitzkrieg investment drive by China in Germany in 2016, mostly on high-tech firms, and the starting takeovers on very big companies for minority shareholding, but who knows. Germany, in any case, and it's to its credit, had maintained a separate political criticism, better than the French, in fact, of Chinese practices. But that largely went unseen, or people assumed, they were just saying, nothing more. But since 2016, on the economic front, the German policy has changed. It has become much more cautious. I think also it's fascinating that you were talking about the Midwest that would eventually decide economic aberration. You think Midwest, you think auto industry, still lots of stuff like that. That's Germany. Germany is at the height of its industrial might, but threatened on several fronts by digital on the one hand, and by the Chinese move on the other. So reasons to think they're not going to be able to move China by themselves, that they need Europe, so they need France. That's a very big argument which has come in. I would like for that a red line for the US. If you want to get us together, you have to take care also of the European heartland. The European heartland happens to be concerned by exactly the same issues as the American Midwest. So if we have a trade war among ourselves on these things, it's going to be much harder. So I would say there is a red line on breaking the German value chain, the capacity to export those marvelous cars or to make them in America. That's a real issue, as much as I understand the nostalgia for American cars.
So what's been the main factor in changing European perceptions towards China? Has it been Trump or Xi Jinping and these Chinese policies towards Europe since 2016?
Oh, Xi Jinping, of course. I always say that on the kind of ideas or analyses that were that China has been a big help. And Xi Jinping has been a big help, so to speak, by making points, proving them. What is extraordinary about Mr. Xi Jinping is that he outlines completely publicly and in law things that sometimes went without saying, but that he feels he needs to say because he feels entirely legitimate in this vision of the world. So that has, of course, helped a lot. And the lack of adjustment, shall we say, to complaints or to issues cropping up, the capacity to alienate several countries in succession, that's not only true about neighbors, it's also been true about quarrels in Europe. Each of these countries is likely at some point to bow, to kowtow, but we'll have a recollection from that. And so what China is getting is a sort of payback, a delayed payback for this, which is also there. So I think Donald Trump is not appreciated in Europe as he is in Asia. I must say the perception remains starkly different in Europe.
How is he appreciated in Asia?
In Asia, he was first seen as a likely transactional leader with which you could do business, even if it was rough business. Now he's viewed as somebody who may be meaning what he says, who may be dangerous, who is a mortal threat to the continuation of China's rise in economic terms, and not as somebody. I mean, all the criticism that we know that goes on every day, something that goes entirely over the heads of especially the Chinese.
I think all of that applies also to defense in Russia. If you substitute Putin for Xi, the same question, I think, remains: is increased European defense expenditure a function of Russian aggression or President Trump? And I think the Russians also hope for a more transactional approach and have been direly disappointed.
And we keep dreaming that we're going to be able somehow or other to rope in Putin, and that proves impossible.
Right.
Thank you, and that's a nice note to end that phase of the discussion on. And I'd like to bring in the audience. I'd like to see where once the person with the mic has appeared. Yeah, to the back. Why don't we start with the gentleman at the back with the glasses? Oh, you both have. Well, why don't we, the younger gentleman, sort of.
Should I stand up?
Yeah, please introduce yourself.
All right,
Please be brief.
Okay, sure. Hello, my name is Danny Cahoon. I'm a student at George Washington University of International Affairs, History and Political Science. I have a question specifically for Mr. Rowe about, earlier you'd mentioned about how the relationship between Europe and the United States is not particularly driven by personalities, but much more by, structures and institutions and things like that. And I was curious about what you thought about sort of the reemergence of older Bush administration officials in the Trump administration, the appointment of Elliott Abrams as special advisor to Venezuela, Secretary Pompeo, and John Bolton as a national security advisor, and what these characters sort of have a history with a more unilateral approach to defense, as seen by their support for the Iraq War, which was a significant break, obviously, between the United States and Europe. And I was curious as to what your take would be about how these officials and their reemergence has for Euro-Atlantic cooperation.
Thank you. And I'd like to also take a question, just a question for our other friends. So does anyone have a question for Michel and François? The gentleman at the front in the red. Question for the French, I hope.
Absolutely.
Thank
Good
you.
evening, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Hudson Institute. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. Very quickly, there was a comment made on perception of a lack of Russian viability in the trade market. And I think what it would behoove the American government to keep in mind is that the Russians have access to hydroelectric energy, solar, wind, guns, bombs, planes, satellites, millions of tons of minerals in the earth that have yet to be unexcavated, so we shouldn't underestimate the Russians in that regard. But aside from that, I was at the National Press Club a few weeks ago speaking to the Turkish admiral of their navy, and he expressed concern over the French involvement and level of intrigue in the Belt and Road Initiative in China. And I was wondering if anyone had any sort of response if the admiral of the Turkish Navy was here regarding French concern in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And one more question. Do we have one more question? Oh, the gentleman with the fine tie in the front.
I'm Matt Gutman. I'm with the United Macedonian Diaspora. My question for you is, what effect will Brexit have on the EU's ability to negotiate, and what does this show for the future of the EU? What can France do in particular to alleviate the concerns with the EU that it's not a short-term national organization?
Thank you.
I take the first question, maybe, and you Michel, you deal with the second. If your question was that French attitude to Belt and Road, and France is one of there are 14 countries which have signed MOUs Belt and Road within the EU, but many of them in the earlier phase, when it was not so, it was done on the side, so to speak. Those MOUs are mechanical; they reproduce each other down to spelling issues on one page. The only two significant ones are the Italian MOU, which raised a lot of polemics, but which is a new type of MOU with more concessions, I must say, to EU rules, and that puts forward the AIIB, the China-founded investment bank, which works more according to international rules than other funds. And the other one is Luxembourg, which is opportunistically taking care of the Brexit issue to try and draw financial capital, very frankly, from London to Luxembourg, is my view of the deal. It's not a pretty thing to contemplate. The French have been holdouts, although we regularly, President Macron regularly emphasized he's interested in the overall project, but we put in front European rules, patterns, international standards. And so before Xi Jinping's state visit to Paris, which took place 2 months ago, there was tremendous pressure from our Chinese friends to sign, as the Italians did, an MOU. President Macron's answer was to invite Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission President, and Madame Merkel, the German Chancellor, for the first time ever during a bilateral state visit, so that Mr. Xi could graphically, optically, directly realize that he has to talk with the EU, with Europeans as a whole, that he cannot go country by country. So that's where we are. Frankly, I mean, I know there are very different views and more articles written on the BRI than on almost any other subject regarding China. I belong to the group that says it's been hyped, it's been inflated in terms of actual amounts. It's very significant when you get close to China, some parts of Southeast Asia, and South Asia around India, essentially. And for the rest, it's more piecemeal. So I don't share the paranoid views that this is the end of the world with China coming.
Peter, the question addressed specifically to you.
Okay, sure. I would just say the Republicans are a big tent party with multiple streams in it, and this president is very different than George W. Bush, and this administration is different than the Bush administration. But even so, there are plenty of supporters of the Iraq War, which is a completely total, not only Republican mainstream position, but included a good chunk of the Democrats, to Hillary Clinton's eternal regret. She voted for the Iraq War in the Senate. So I don't think that can disqualify one in the eyes even of President Trump, who's skeptical of the Iraq War because he needs an advisory class. I do think that, since you raised John Bolton, I mean, he is an unabashed, unsentimental defender of American interests. That's how he sees his role. And he has a very straightforward view of American sovereignty. And so that's partially why, although he was important in the Bush administration, he now is in the middle of the center of power and action. I think that probably counts for that. I take your point. In addition to caviar and vodka, I should have added Russian weapon systems. We, of course, have the S-400 pending sale to the Turks. That's a very important Russian export market. And maybe just the last point on the European negotiating position, only because I'm an American. If there's to be a rerun of TTIP negotiations in the future, the European position is going to be a lot weaker without Great Britain, because they had Britain as part of that. And so I don't think one can just dust off the negotiated TTIP agreement and bring it back to the front, because Europe's going to be in a very different place, presumably after October 31st. But who knows? If the Brits stay in, then I guess that's more likely. Not that I see TTIP anywhere on the horizon, but...
More Brexit?
More Brexit.
There's actually an infinity of Brexit. If you think about it, after October the 31st, the implementation phases, the repercussions, But more Brexit?
Let's not talk about Brexit. but maybe a word about Russia, Turkey, the Middle East, NATO. Since through Middle Eastern eyes, the big failure by NATO was about Turkey, not so much military expenditures, Germany and things like that. It was more profoundly the political inability to deal with the issue of Turkey. And if we are losing Turkey, the West is losing Turkey, that would be a very dramatic strategic setback. And once again, now on the question of China trade and Europe, it seems to me that there are traditionally in Europe various centers of power. The Commission, which is the kind of executive branch, the Council, which is the structure where the governments negotiate between themselves, and the Parliament, of course. The traditional French approach is to value the Council, that's to say the intergovernmental structure. And when Macron is perceived as more integrationist than others, he remains in the tradition of stressing the importance of intergovernmental structures. Now, in the current context of strong challenge both from China and from the US administration on trade issues, it's of vital interest for the French to have a strong commission and to have in the commission strong personalities, contrary to here also the tradition, which was to send to Brussels personalities who are more qualified for the compromise abilities than to defend strong policies. Now, if we want to deal with China the way we should, and if we want to play our cards in the trade negotiations the way we should, it's very important to have strong personalities and to have a strong commission.
And brings us to the obvious question, which is,
Who's going to be the commissioner?
who's going to be the president of the commission, and is France or Germany winning this test of strength right now over Manfred Weber? If you would like to share your thoughts, or if François would like to share his thoughts.
Just to say that I think the papers don't report it well by pointing it as a purely French-German tussle.
No.
We have an EPP problem. There is a Weber problem. But there's a host of other governments which have their own wish and may want to avoid what looked like the Merkel solution without necessarily adopting a French candidate, I hasten to add. And I look, for example, at the Dutch. I look at some Eastern Europeans, and I think they want to get out of that. So, there's been a picture painted, including in the FT, of President Macron isolating himself. And sometimes the French are not good communicators.
Yes.
They don't do all the homework they should do with the 27 countries. I say 27 in this case. But on these issues, I don't think he's totally isolated. And I think he has the l'astuce, the cleverness not to commit himself completely to one or two guys which he would be pushing. Whereas Germany...
Especially the obvious guy.
Especially the obvious guy.
Could you care to throw a few names in?
No, I'm not in the... I do Asia.
I'll ask you later.
I was gonna answer something about Brexit instead. This is the one issue where China doesn't want to divide Europe. Paradoxically, is Brexit.
Why?
Because it's in interest to have the UK inside the EU, basically as a free trader, with the London Financial Plus. And so I think the Chinese, like the Japanese, but they don't say it loudly
That's very interesting.
they are aghast. I have had in front of me a top-level cadre from the Central Committee looking at me and saying, why don't you French make concessions to the UK so they can remain.
Very, 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 very interesting. Sort of.
Just to inject some surprise.
So I'm sure that several people will be intrigued to know that in the Conservative Party leadership
Yes.
race. Peter.
Well, I don't know this issue very well, so far be it for me to start speaking on stage, but I'll do it anyway. I read the British vacillation on 5G as a precursor to a free trade negotiation with the Chinese to try to curry favor in a post-Brexit scenario where they're going to need not only an American FTA, but also a relationship with China. And the future of Great Britain outside of the European Union would be one where they obviously lean heavily on the Commonwealth. That's not sufficient. Get some sort of links to Europe, and then they're going to need both the Americans and the Chinese. But with that, we're at Brexit, which we didn't want to discuss. So here I am.
I'm always.
So you wouldn't read the 5G decision at all?
It's one of the several issues which have blown up the British governments, but only one of the several in the recent weeks. So I'm not absolutely sure we should take our cue from that.
All right.
From that move. But yes, there are temptations, of course. And who knows if Bojo is leading the country where his instinct may lead him.
And I'd like to invite the woman just here with the papers in the air for a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Li Yang. I'm thinking about the title. You are talking about crisis and competition, and of course you are talking about trade in political sense or in business sense. So I just wonder, there's two ways to think about it. One is hostile, the other one is cooperation, more friendly. So I just, in hostile, we might think about intelligence or technology theft, that type of things, and nationalism and terrorists. How do they affect their cooperation? On the other hand, you might want to think, they say China, they are thinking Confucius Institute is a good way to sort of soften all the hostility rather than improve the language and the cooperation. Probably was helpful. So I just wonder if you can say in this direction, hostile or cooperation, which way play a major point in our cooperation?
Thank you. Maybe we'll take another question to go along with that. The gentleman in the back with the glasses, the neighbor this time. Yeah.
Stanley Kober. In his first inaugural address, President Lincoln appealed to the mystic chords of memory to try to hold the United States together on the eve of the South secession. It did not work. The United States was held together by Gettysburg, Sherman's march through Georgia. That's not an option available to the EU. So you're back to the mystic chords of memory. With us, it took 70, 80 years. You're like 70, 80 years now from the formation of the post-World War II institutions. Is it fated that with each generation, the emotional ties will fade? What are the mystic chords of memory now for the EU and the transatlantic cooperation as a whole?
I believe in something which is European culture. I think that the fact that people are traveling around the world today will reinforce that common ground between the Europeans. Because, you know, you don't know exactly what it means to be a European. But when you go to America, when you spend a few weeks or a few months in America, and when you are back to Europe, you feel at home. And you feel that there is something which makes you closer to the Germans and to the Italians and to the Brits than to the Americans. That's a fact of life. Now, the new thing with the modern world is that you don't only go to America, but you go also to Asia. You go to China, you go to India, you go to Australia. Sometimes you go to Australia to learn English. And when you are back to France, to Germany, to Switzerland, you feel that there is something in Europe that you were missing when you were abroad. And to me, that's more powerful for the young generation than the memory of the past. Maybe I'm wrong, but discussing with my children and soon to my grandchildren, I think that this is something very powerful. But you are right to ask the question of the level of emotions, which is, of course, more important than everything else.
I think each of us is allowed his chord, to use your vocabulary. Mine is different, although we're both post-war kids, I guess. I can tell you until '89, for me, Europe was practical. I had absolutely no sense of the issues. I was doing Asia. I was very Americanized. I had no sense of European issues. I'm sorry to say that Eastern Europe was a very distant relative with very little existence. So the paradox is things became clearer. After '89, the problems that came to a French from German reunification and the necessity to adjust, to understand what the world was about. And if you look at opinion polls today, you'd be surprised by how many Europeans actually fear war among Europeans. The percentage is much higher than one would think, which means that people realize it's Europe or else. For monetary integration, the famous fabulous euro, about which so many experts decried by saying it's an underpoured currency and so forth, the attachment has grown. For participation into European elections, you look at the last EU elections, the participation has grown, and quite a lot, which means that the EU is becoming the contested battlefield for politics, which is, to me, the test of reality for a political entity. So yes, we're a half-finished federation. Yes, our compromises in Brussels means we print kids' money, with no recognizable monuments or individuals on the bills, if the money bills still exist within 20 years, by the way. I have my doubts. But I think we are still anchored in the past, and there is much more common realization of the issues for the future and of the risks. Countries like China, by the way, make us aware of the risks too.
Maybe I'll weigh in on that.
I'd like just to step in just briefly before bringing you in, of course, which is the view in Brussels is not that the sort of Gettysburg or acts of political standing firm are not available to them. They don't think that there's only memory and emotion, there's nothing they can do politically to marshal the Union and keep it together. And in fact, there's a certain atmosphere of self-congratulation about the fact that the Europeans managed to discover enough sovereignty, mobilize it in a certain way in order to bring the Greeks to heel, in order to bring the British to heel, in order to push the Italians towards a cliff edge, in order to make sure that the Poles knew who was in charge when it came to these questions of judiciary. And I was just there last week, and there's a real atmosphere of self-congratulation about this, that the European Union has discovered what one of its prime proponents, a gentleman called Luc Middelaar, calls the Machiavellian moment, the moment when a political order realizes it is threatened and has to discover its carnivorous aspects in order to survive. So whereas I think it would be unreasonable to think that any sort of European military will be around enforcing the European Union's staying together in any reasonable time horizon, the European Union, in a way, has become quite a violent institution with deploying cliff edges to Greece's EU membership, the cliff edge currently deployed to Britain, the cliff edge towards the Central Europeans' voting rights. They have discovered this capacity to act politically, and it's quite impressive. So Peter.
I think the issue with those confrontations with the Greeks, now with the Italians, is that it hasn't produced a more intense European citizenry in those countries.
It actually undermines the very emotions that we were talking about.
Well, that's just it. So I think European identity is rather pronounced when it is considered a supplement to one's national identities. But the true test is in times of crisis, whether or not national politics are prepared to sacrifice on behalf of Europe. After 9/11, we had Ohioans go off to die essentially for New Yorkers, one could say, but no one thought of it that way because you're an American first. Annually, poorer states like Mississippi are, through the American budget, transferred huge sums of money from, say, New York, but that's never really a talking point anywhere in the American press because we consider ourselves Americans first. And I think if the basis of Europe is going to be that it's created standards, it's created norms for the continent, and so that benefits everyone and that it raises the quality of life and so forth, that's a very brittle and fragile basis because as soon as there's an economic downturn, you begin to have, I think, striations and tears between the different national polities. So I think when times are good, Europe looks fairly stable, but as soon as there is a downturn of one sort or the other, be it a migration crisis owing to American inaction in Syria, from North Africa, or on the other hand, an economic crisis, I think we begin to see that Europe might not be quite as strong as it is. But I think basically that question is the question of Europe today. Where does sovereignty really lie, and what are the citizens prepared to support? I don't think that's incompatible with anything.
No, I agree. We are back to the issue of the Eurozone budget.
Right.
No representation without taxation.
So I fear we've run out of time. I don't know if you'd like to make a very short closing remark, each to the audience.
For me, I'll start, but let others take the broader conclusion. It's the entire paradox of the situation where we have the worst public opinion climate in general terms, pessimism about Europe from the outside, including from the US, pessimism about this US administration and its leader on the one hand, and on the other hand, when it comes to this key issue for the future, which is China's role and the way it's going and the way we can manage it, handle it, or face it, we actually have more points of agreement than we've probably ever had in the past 30 years.
I would be very philosophical, and I would say that what's at stake now is a political model. It's about liberal institutions, democratic processes, and on that front, for the time being, there is a huge debate between many, not only between Europe and the US, but inside Europe, inside the US. And in that respect, what is now perceived as a threat coming from China, but also from Russia and other autocratic systems, may be useful to bring us together again.
Thank you. I'll leave the closing word to Peter.
All right, thanks. I think over the past several decades, for a lot of people in Washington, the European Union has been opaque, very difficult to understand. There's so many institutions and kind of labyrinth-like ways that they operate. And for us, the translator has always been Great Britain. They're sort of the bridge between Washington and Brussels. And that stool at the table is now going to be empty. And so I'm grateful that you all are here and that going forward we can hopefully collaborate more and continue these discussions, because to understand the European Union, we're going to need partners that are in the room. And it's been a great discussion, so thank you.
Thank you. And to make a joke on the traditional saying at Passover, next year in Paris.
Next year in Paris. Very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. You come to the dinner?
Yes, we'll be there.
Okay.
You'll be at the dinner.
That was a very nice yes.
Good.